So right now at Concordia, we're in this series. It is called the Red Letter Challenge, and the premise behind the series is this. If you read through the New Testament Gospels, Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, a lot of times you'll notice in the Gospels there are these words that are printed in red. And this is an editorial decision by a lot of publishers who publish a lot of Bibles to put the words of Jesus in red because the words of Jesus are incredible words. And they're words we ought to study and ponder and mull over and take to heart. And yet, if all we ever do with the words of Jesus is study them and ponder them and mull over them, we're actually missing one of the most important things that we can do with the words of Jesus. Because according to Jesus himself, we ought to take his words and actually put them into practice in our lives. Jesus puts it like this, Matthew 7, verse 24, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, he is like a wise man." And that's what this Red Letter Challenge is all about, because we are challenging ourselves to take the words of Jesus and to live them out, to take the words of Jesus and to put them into practice each and every day. So I was thinking about this. We live in a society, maybe you've noticed this, in a culture that is kind of divided. Anybody else ever notice that? And we're divided by a lot of different things, right? We're divided geographically. We got people who live on the left coast and on the right coast in the center of the country. We're divided chronologically. We got people who are older and people who are younger, people who are babies, people who are middle-aged. We have some other kind of strange divisions too, like we're divided over the kinds of pets that we like. Are you a cat person? Are you a dog person? Are you a ferret person? What kind of a person are you? We're divided over that. We're even divided when it comes to our bathrooms. Are you the kind of person who hangs the toilet paper overhanded in the proper godly manner? Or are you the kind of person who is abominable, okay? And hangs it in the underhanded manner where you got to reach up under there and try to get it. In this city, we are divided. We're divided into people who are north of 1604 and south of 1604, especially yesterday, right? You figure this out. If you tried to cross 1604 at like Bitters or Huebner or Blanco, it was closed down, construction, it was a mess. We're divided. We're divided by the foods that we eat and what we call these foods. Is it potato or is it potato? Is it tomato or is it tomato? Is candy corn candy or is it corn? Okay? Now, here's the thing. My wife says it's candy, it's full of sugar, it's bad for you. Then I say, why would they call it corn? It sounds like a vegetable that is good to me. You see, we're divided. Tonight at 5:30, we're going to be a whole nation divided. Who you rooting for in the Super Bowl? How many Pats fans we got in here? Okay. How many Rams fans we got in here? Okay. How many of you are still bitter about the NFC Championship and the Saints, and so you just don't care? You see? We're a nation. We're a culture, we're a society that is divided. Now, of course, some of these divisions do run a little bit deeper. Some of these disagreements are a little bit harder. We're divided in this country over race. A lot of people wonder, what is racism? How far does racism go? How deep does it extend? How should we deal with it and address it? We're divided over race. Have you noticed we're divided over politics? Has anybody watched the news, like in the last 40 years? We got people on one side of the aisle and people on the other side of the aisle, and sometimes these people on these two sides of the aisles don't like each other very much, and sometimes they get so upset with each other that they're almost slanderous of each other. We're divided. We're divided over morality. And sometimes we can actually have a really good moral position, and yet we communicate it in all the wrong ways. And it winds up doing more harm than good. We're divided in so many ways. Today, I want to talk to you about an antidote that the Bible gives us to division in our world, in our lives, in our society. And it's just one word, a one-word antidote, and the word is forgiveness. Because forgiveness, perhaps more than anything else, is the thing that can heal the divisions that exist among us. It is the thing that can take people who are divided and bring them together. It is the thing that can take people who are filled with anger and resentment and bitterness over divisions and give them a little bit of peace. And so today we're going to be talking about what Jesus has to say about forgiveness, and this takes us to our text for today from Matthew chapter 18, because in Matthew 18, Jesus is going to give us kind of a tour de force in what it means to be a forgiving person. And so Matthew 18, beginning in verse 21. Peter approached Jesus and he asked him, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or my sister who sins against me? As many as 7 times? As our text for today opens, we got one of Jesus' followers, Peter, and Peter comes to Jesus with a question. It's a question about forgiveness. Lord, he says, if somebody does something wrong to me, how many times should I forgive them? How about 7 times? Now, you need to understand that when Peter asks this question, he thinks he's being quite magnanimous. There was an old Jewish teacher rule, an old Jewish rabbinical rule that was basically a 3 strikes and you're out rule when it comes to forgiveness. Somebody sins against you once, you should forgive them. Somebody sins against you twice, you should go the extra mile, forgive them again. But if somebody sins against you 3 times, you got to be kind of dumb to forgive them again. They're just going to keep on doing it to you over and over and over again. And so forgive them 3 times, but at the 3rd time, you just got to stop and you got to cut them loose and you got to let them go. Now, here's the thing. Peter, by this point, has been following Jesus for a while. And Peter knows that Jesus isn't just any old normal Jewish teacher. He's not a normal everyday rabbi. Jesus is a man who is about grace and mercy and forgiveness. And so Peter has a hunch that maybe Jesus would want to extend that principle of forgiveness out a little bit. And so what Peter does is he takes the old rabbinical rule and he doubles it and adds one just for good measure. And he says, okay, Lord, I've been working on this mercy, grace, forgiveness thing, and I think I've got this figured out. If somebody comes and sins against me, the rabbis are wrong. I shouldn't forgive them 3 times. I think I should forgive them, let's do 7 times, Peter says. What do you think, Lord? Peter asks. To which Jesus responds, Matthew 18, verse 22, I tell you, not as many as 7, but 77 times. Jesus takes Peter's magnanimity and he just blows it all to smithereens. He says, you think 7 times is enough? Not even close. How about 77 times? Now, I want to make sure you get this. When Jesus says you ought to forgive someone who sins against you 77 times, he's not inviting you to take out an abacus and go, okay, somebody sins against me once, I'm going to move that one ball over here. Somebody sins against me twice, okay, how about a second one, and a third one, and a fourth one, and a fifth one, and let's just go all the way up to 77 times, and we'll make it the new 77 times and you're out rule. That's not what Jesus is doing here. In fact, Jesus doesn't pull this number 77 from the middle of nowhere. He actually gets it from a story in Genesis chapter 4 in the Old Testament about a guy named Lamech. Lamech is one of the descendants of a guy named Cain. Some of you may know the story of Cain and Abel. Cain commits the first murder in history when he kills his brother Abel. Well, in Genesis chapter 4, there's this guy named Lamech, and somebody does something mean to Lamech, and it upsets him very, very much, and so Lamech commits the second murder in history when he kills this guy. And what he does after he kills this guy is he goes to his 2 wives, because he's also the first polygamist in history, and he brags about the murder that he has just committed. Genesis 4, verse 23, Lamech says, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, pay attention to my words. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If my relative Cain was to be avenged 7 times over, then for Lamech, I'm going to be avenged 77 times. Here's the kind of guy that Lamech is. Lamech is the kind of guy who is very threatening, very foreboding, and he's a guy that you don't want to cross. Because if you punch him, he's going to punch back harder. If you do something to him once, he's going to do it back to you 77 times over. Lamech seems to have a limitless lust for vengeance. But what Jesus does in Matthew 18 is he takes this number from Genesis 4, he takes this number of Lamech and he turns it on its head. He says, you don't want a limitless lust for vengeance. What you want is a compounding capacity for forgiveness. Your forgiveness should have no outer limits, Jesus says. And just to kind of drive his point home, just to make sure it goes deep, Jesus continues by telling a little story about forgiveness. Matthew 18, verse 23, Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle accounts, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought before him. Since he did not have the money to pay it back, his master commanded that he, his wife, his children, and everything that he had be sold to repay his debt. Jesus says, once upon a time there is this king, and this king has this servant, and the servant is in the habit of borrowing money from the king. He's in the habit of borrowing a lot of money from the king. He winds up borrowing 10,000 talents from the king. Let me help you understand what this would have entailed, okay? In the ancient world, a talent was a unit of money. It was also a unit of weight, and one talent in the ancient world equaled 130 pounds. Now, when a talent was a unit of money, it was made of gold, so one talent would be 130 pounds of gold. So that means, using the current rate of exchange, one talent, just one talent in today's currency, would be worth $2,472,451.40. Just one talent. But this servant, he borrows from the king not one talent, how many? 10,000 talents. So you got to multiply it by 10,000. And so that means that this servant owes this king, in today's currency, $24,724,514,000. There ain't no way this servant is ever paying back that kind of a debt. And the king knows it. So the king tries to do what anyone would do to recoup his loss. He decides in verse 25 that he's going to take that servant, his wife, his children, and everything that he had, and sell it all to try to at least pay back a little bit of the debt. In the ancient world, this king is kind of like the modern day version of a loan shark, okay? And there's a reason that we call a loan shark and not a lone bunny or a lone poodle or something like that. It's because when you cross a loan shark, they mean business. When a loan shark calls in a debt, he's serious. And when this king calls in his servant's debt, he's serious. But what happens next in this story would have shocked anybody who was listening to it. Because what Jesus does is he takes a completely unexpected turn as he continues. Matthew 18, verse 26, Jesus continues, the servant at that point fell face down before the king, and he said, "Be patient with me, and I'll pay you everything." Then the master of that servant, he had compassion. He released him, and he forgave him of the loan. $24.7 billion gone, just like that. All because of forgiveness. This king forgave his servant. That's a pretty incredible story, don't you think? It almost seems like kind of an unrealistic story. $24.7 billion. How do you forgive that? And yet, in this story, you know what Jesus does? He gives us an actual roadmap for forgiveness, how forgiveness should look and how forgiveness can work in our lives. We see it right here in verse 27 with what the master does. The master does three things. Number one, he has compassion on the servant. Number two, he releases the servant. Number three, he forgives the servants of the loan. And it's these three things that I want to spend the balance of our time talking about together this morning. Because these three things are things we must do. They are things forgiveness requires if we're going to offer it to somebody else in our lives. And so the first thing that forgiveness requires some compassion. Forgiveness requires some compassion. Notice again what the master does in verse 27. The master of the servant, the very first thing that he does is he has compassion. Now, in our day and age, when we think of compassion, we think of it as kind of an ushy, squishy, mushy, gushy feeling that we have inside. And on the one hand, that's kind of right. The New Testament written in the Greek language, Greek word for compassion here, kind of a fun word. I love this, splaggnizomai. And it's actually the Greek word for somebody's gut. And so you've heard of a gut-level feeling before. That's part of what compassion is in the Bible, but that's not all that compassion is in the Bible. Compassion goes far beyond something you feel in your gut in the Bible. If I had to give you kind of a synonym for what compassion is in the Bible, I would give you this word, empathy. Because that's really what makes compassion work. Empathy. If you want to have compassion on somebody else, you got to feel what they feel. Even if only for a moment. You got to walk in their shoes, even if only for a second. And part of the reason so many people have so much trouble forgiving is because they cannot seem to practice empathy. They look at somebody who has sinned against them and they cannot feel what they feel, even for a moment. They cannot walk in their shoes, even for a second. There's this professor at Yale University, his name is Miroslav Volf, and he actually writes about this. He says, "Forgiveness flounders because I exclude somebody who sins against me, my enemy, from the community of humans, even as I exclude myself from the community of sinners." Miroslav Volf is saying, here's what happens when you can't forgive. You look at your enemy and you forget that they are human just like you. You treat him somehow as subhuman, as some sort of a monster, and so you can't forgive him. Not only that, you forget that you are a sinner just like them. Because after all, you would never do to them what they did to you, and all of a sudden, forgiveness falls apart. If you want to forgive someone, no matter what they've done to you, you need to remember that at least in some way they are like you. I mean, why do you think the most compassionate man who ever lived, even though he wasn't a human, he became a human, and even though he wasn't a sinner, he spent a lot of time hanging out with sinners? The reason that Jesus did that was for the sake of empathy. And because of that empathy, and because of his compassion, he won for the world the greatest forgiveness that can ever be given. Because that's what forgiveness requires. Forgiveness requires compassion. Second thing forgiveness requires. Forgiveness requires release. Forgiveness requires release. Back to Matthew 18, verse 27, the master of the servant, he had compassion, and then he released the servant. He just let him go. And if you're going to forgive someone, this is something you got to do too. You got to let somebody go. Not only that, you got to let the sin that they have committed against you go. It's so easy when you're hurt to take the sin that's been committed against you and just hold it real close to you. To revel in it almost in some kind of self-righteous indignation. To think about it, to get angry about it, to become bitter over it, to mull it over, to hold it tight. If you do that, the truth of the matter is this: the only person you're really hurting and destroying is yourself. There's another guy from Yale, his name is Frederick Buechner, and he writes about this. He says, of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun. And it really kind of is. Because when you get angry, you can lick your wounds. You can smack your lips over grievances that are long past. You can roll your tongue over the prospect of bitter confrontations that are still to come. You can savor the last toothsome morsel of both the pain that you have been given and the pain that you are giving back. You can feel so righteous when you're angry. In many ways, Frederick Buechner says, anger and bitterness and resentment and grudges, they're like a feast that is fit for a king. But here's the drawback. The drawback is that all you're really doing is wolfing down yourself. You're just eating yourself up from the inside out. Think about somebody you know who can't seem to forgive. And ask yourself, are they tranquil? Or is there something inside of them that's tormented? Are they happy? Or are they deeply hurting? Has all their bitterness made anything better? Of course it hasn't, because to forgive, you got to let all that go. Forgiveness requires release. That's the second thing forgiveness requires. Third thing forgiveness requires then is forgiveness requires a payment. Forgiveness requires a payment. It's going to cost you something. You're going to pay a price to forgive. Matthew 18, verse 27, one more time. The master of the servant, he has compassion on the servant. He releases the servant, and then he pays for the servant's loan. He forgives him of the loan, all $24.7 billion of it. And just so you understand how difficult this would have been for this king. In this day and age, it's not like the king could have gone to the Fed and said, okay, we have a problem. I just forgave $24.7 billion, and so the nation's a little short. Can you print me some more money? It didn't work that way back then. Not only that, the king, it's not like he had an LLC so he could have his company take the hit. In the ancient world, the king was the one who owned everything in a kingdom, every field, every piece of cattle, okay, every home, even all the money in the kingdom, ultimately, all belonged to the king. That's why if you go and look at ancient coins from the ancient world, they always have on the front of them a picture of the who? The king, because he was the one who owned everything. And so for this king to forgive $24.7 billion would have been an intensely personal hit to this king. But not only that, because the king owned all the money in all the nation, this would have also been a big hit to the nation because he was the one who provided the nation with all the money. In fact, the current GDP of El Salvador, you know what it is? $24.7 billion. And so forgiving a debt like this could wreck a modern-day nation like that. Can you imagine how scary this must have been for this king? He puts his own livelihood on the line. He puts his nation's stability on the line just for the sake of forgiveness. That's how far this king is willing to go just for the sake of forgiveness. And here's where this story gets real personal and real practical for us, because you got to ask yourself eventually, how far am I willing to go just for the sake of forgiveness? What kind of debt am I willing to pay just for the sake of forgiveness? Now, I know that in a room this size, there are at least a few people who are thinking to themselves right now, you know, that all sounds real nice. Forgiveness, it's the Christian-y thing to do. I know, you got to talk about it in church, but you don't understand. I can't forgive somebody. The spouse who betrayed me, the child who disowned me, the person who's harassed me and made my life so horrible and so difficult. I can't forgive that. If this is you and you're struggling with forgiveness, can I just remind you that this story actually doesn't end at Matthew 18, verse 27. There's more to this story. Some of you may know it. After the king forgives this servant of this $24.7 billion debt, the servant goes out and finds one of his buddies. And his buddy owes him a paltry sum of money in comparison to the debt that he has just been forgiven of. And the servant goes to his buddy and he says, you know what? I'm a little tight right now. I need that money that I loaned to you. I need it back. And his buddy says, I would give it to you if I had it, but I don't. Just give me a little bit. I'll scrimp, I'll save, I'll get it back together, and I'll get it back to you. And the servant says, wait just a second, that's not good enough. And so he drags his buddy off to small claims court. And he gets his buddy thrown into jail because his buddy won't pay him back right now. And word of what has happened reaches the king. And when the king hears about this, he is furious. And so here's how the story ends. Matthew 18, verse 34. The master, the king, hands over the servant to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay everything that was owed. Because this servant refuses to forgive, you know what he winds up with? Just a lot of pain. If you refuse to forgive, here's the warning. You know what you can wind up with? Just a lot of pain. One of the most difficult moments of forgiveness in my life actually came a few years ago. A lot of you know this. I have two kids. They're both adopted. I got my little 5-year-old daughter, Hope, and she's a precious, sweet little girl. And a couple of years after we had adopted Hope, we went back to the same adoption agency that we used to adopt her, and we were going to adopt our second. And so the way this works is you pay a fee to the adoption agency and they match you with a birth mother. And then once you're matched, you pay through the adoption agency to the birth mother to kind of cover some of her expenses as she is getting ready to give birth. And so we get matched with this birth mother and everything is going great. And she goes into labor and she goes to the hospital and we rush down to the hospital and we're excited. We're all there. We're celebrating and we're holding the baby once she gives birth and singing over the baby, having a great time. And we are so excited that we have added another addition to our family. And the way that it works in Texas law is you got to wait 48 hours until the birth mom can finally sign and release her rights to the baby so that you can take the baby home with you. And so the 48 hours came and the 48 hours went. And she changed her mind. And we didn't come home with a baby. I remember driving home, and there were 2 car seats in the back, and one was empty. And I remember getting home, and I walked upstairs to the nursery, and we had a little bassinet in there. There was no baby to put in the bassinet. It was tough. Tough for me, tough for my wife, tough for my daughter. And yes, I was angry. I was really angry. In fact, the first thought that popped into my mind was, I've got to call an attorney. Get this all sorted out. This can't be right. I got to get back at this person who did this to me and to my family. But here's the thing, there was really nothing I could do. It's just part of the process, part of Texas law. And I finally had to come to a point where I had a decision to make. I could either stay bitter and resentful and angry at what had happened and at what my family had gone through, or I could make a choice to forgive. Now, I'm no expert at forgiveness. So it took me a while. It took me a lot of soul searching and a lot of praying. It took a lot of counsel. Melody and I talked a lot. We talked to Pastor Tucker, just trying to sort this all through. But eventually, I got to a point where I finally chose forgiveness. And we chose to try again. And when I made that choice to forgive, the result of that choice was this. It's okay. And you know what? When I look at his smile and I look at his picture, I realize that when I chose forgiveness, when we chose to try again, we gained a son. Because that's the power of forgiveness. You know, we have a God. We have a God who's given us so much. He gives us money, He gives us our bodies, He gives us relationships, He gives us our very lives. And we're His servants. Now here's the problem. Sometimes as His servants, we take what He gives us and we just throw it away. We squander it. We don't treat our bodies the way that we always should. We don't exercise or eat right, do all that stuff. Sometimes we break our relationships by betrayal and lies and all sorts of terrible stuff. We use our money selfishly rather than selflessly. We can wind up frittering our whole lives away. And here's the thing, when we do that, with what the Master has given to us, the Master has a choice. He can become bitter and vengeful and angry. He can condemn us and consign us to hell, or He can choose forgiveness. You know what the cross is? It's proof that God has chosen forgiveness. And here's the thing. It cost God a lot, because when God chose forgiveness, He didn't gain a son. He gave His Son. But when God chose forgiveness, He also got you. Because that's the power of forgiveness. And so here's the invitation. Take that power that has been given to you by God to save you and use that power to bless others. Make a decision to forgive. Because, my friends, it is a decision that you will not regret. Let's stand and pray. Heavenly Father, thanks for the amazing forgiveness that comes through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Father, that power that you have given us in forgiveness, the way that you have made us your own and your people and your children, may we take that power and use it to bless the world, to heal relationships, to draw other people close, just like you have drawn us close. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. And now as you leave this place, remember, you go with a God who's forgiven you. And because of that, oh, you are blessed. And so the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine on you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up His countenance on you and give you His peace. And so, as you go, take that power of forgiveness and shine like stars in the universe as you hold out God's precious message of life. Amen.